So, if you can remember back to what feels like ages ago when we parted ways that Thursday before spring break, we had started talking about the Second World War, the causes, how the United States got involved, what was happening on the home front, and this was the slide that we ended on. And remember, I made a point of mentioning the Double V program and African Americans in the war because if you can remember, I discussed how the civil rights movement that will really take shape in the 1950s and 1960s was galvanized in some of the organizing that went into the Second World War. So remember that the part of the justification for the United States to go to war was this belief that the fascist regimes in Europe, specifically Nazi Germany, at its core was very racist, and the dehumanizing of people in the various programs that were used to orchestrate the Holocaust throughout Europe, and the civil right civil rights advocates in the United States wanting to expose then the hypocrisy of the American government in justifying a war against a country for reasons that it believed were uh, rooted in trying to rid the world of this evil that produced the Holocaust, and how African Americans were still treated as second class citizens at home. So this juxtaposing of this fight in Europe against Nazi Germany and the treatment of African Americans in the United States by the United States government and not being seen as equals in much the same way that the process of removing initially Jewish Germans from the equal status in society to start to move them down as inferior, to the point that obviously the outcome was horrific in Europe, and wanting to leverage these campaigns that were happening internationally domestically after the war. So that's part of the reason that this Double V program and what the civil rights movement will would have gained steam after the Second World War. But remember also that I mentioned as well as we parted that an unfortunate outcome of the Second World War at home was the imprisonment of Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent. So remember that the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, December 7th, 1941. So you can see not even 2 months after that, in February of 1942, Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which authorized the roundup and relocation out of military necessity Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent. This predominantly occurred in western states, states along the Pacific coastline, because there was fear that the Japanese Americans represented a threat to American security. There was a belief that they were acting as spies. So the American government believed they were justified, as you can see there with the last point. It was held up as well. This executive order that was challenged as unconstitutional was actually held up by the Supreme Court because it deemed that there are extreme circumstances, one of those extreme circumstances being war, in which people's civil liberties can be essentially suppressed, and that rationale justified the essentially imprisonment, right, in camps. And there were 110,000 Japanese Americans placed in these camps. Predominantly, there were the main camps, which I will show you there. show you there. So the triangles represent the main camps where uh, Japanese Americans, people of Japanese descent, were relocated. And then you see this exclusion area line here, right? You can see this line. That is the area in which anybody who who was of Japanese descent were not allowed to be located at. So they had to essentially, if anybody living in San Francisco, anywhere along within that line, had to be removed to one of those camps and then basically monitored. So we think, what is this like? And you can see the top left picture. This is people arriving at one of these camps to be processed in. You can see obviously there's families that are being told to relocate. The top right picture, gives you sort of the full idea of what these camps in some parts look like. I mean, these are essentially military prisons, and there are historians who study this era and Japanese internment and define these places as concentration camps. Now, I know that the idea of a concentration camp is very much part of the Holocaust and how people understand and think about that history. But when you think about, what is a concentration camp, it doesn't necessarily have to be like how it ended up in the Holocaust, where people were sent and then eventually genocide occurred. They're basically a concentration of a particular group of people who are seen as, in this case, a threat to national security or are undesirable. And so labeling Japanese internment camps as concentration camps is what some historians will argue is justified given what the definition of that term should be. Either way, you see that the bottom picture is what was shown to the public. That they look like normal homes for the most part. People are still, a gentleman on the bed there is reading the paper. There's a man on the phone, calling somebody. The woman sitting there appears to be knitting, right? So it's like this the depiction then that okay, yes, we had to remove them, but they're still living a normal life. And for the most part, many of them did carry on normal activities. Some of them formed baseball teams on these camps, but you have to think about what kind of message does this send? How does somebody's dignity are affected by these policies as someone seen as unwanted or as a threat, and how that stokes fears, xenophobic fears and nativist fears, and creates racist actions towards Japanese Americans. So it was something that was not a very positive aspect of the war, and we'll talk more about some of those in just a moment. But something else it's important to recognize, and I know someone asked in one of their rapid writings, what happened to, or when did the Depression end? And that really, many historians point to, it was the Second World War, right? This, like the industry had to start manufacturing, which meant it had to be funded, which meant it had to grow also productivity, which meant more jobs. So that's really what helped get the economy out of the Depression. And you can see there the average GDP right before the war. So the United States enters the war in late 1941, pretty much beginning in 1942. But in 1940, average per capita income per household, and these are in these eras numbers, so don't think that this is in today's dollars. But you can still see it's a significant jump, right? You're talking, pretty much $700 increase in people's average per capita income from before the war to the end of the war. And then another thing that became really popular was the GI Bill. And if you remember, we talked about the war bonus movement after the First World War. Remember, there was talk about paying soldiers a bonus stipend for their service in the war, which many politicians opposed. They did not like the idea of essentially acknowledging that American soldiers were a mercenary force. And so they decided instead to hand out a tax break. If you recall, in the 1920s, it was a tax break to all Americans and to industry. But basically, it was, in their minds, the same as paying them, right? If you don't ask for more in taxes, it's like handing them a check. And that was the idea. But by the time they got to the Great Depression, remember all of those veterans of the First World War who felt like they were owed a bonus check went to the Capitol, demanded payment, and in a very ugly scene, were forced to were removed forcibly by police and the National Guard. So the United States government did not want a repeat of that. So they developed the GI Bill, which was supposed to help the men coming back from war to do things to get their lives started. And a lot of that, we very much associate with a college education, but it was more than that. It also offered other forms of job training, buying homes, you can see with mortgage loans. And when it's changing the demographics of America, it's changing the the educated populace, right? Because before, people really aren't, for the most part, still a smaller percentage of the population were going to college. But after the war, the massive amounts of men returning who followed through on their GI Bill sort of changes the demographics as far as the type of education somebody had. There are going to be more people now who are going to have a bachelor's degree of some sort. However, this was not applied equally. It was harder for African Americans to use a GI Bill in any form. Very few were able to even use the money, or very few of them were able to even access the funds to, say, buy a home or go to college. So it was a sweeping investment in young Americans, but again, in a very discriminatory fashion. And then the last thing we want to end on here is thinking about this popularized notion of the Second World War as being a good war. We think about, okay, it's the ultimate good of the Allies trying to defeat this evil that was fascism and Nazi Germany and all of that entailed. But we can obviously have the discussion about, can war be good? But beyond that, we need to think, okay, what else was a product of this war? One, we have to acknowledge the fact that it was during the Second World War where civilians became targets. And it was done on both sides. Both the Allies and the Axis had no issues targeting civilian populations and knowing that civilians would be dying. And that is not, that's an outcome of the Second World War that a lot of times people gloss over or don't want to acknowledge. And so you see the first number there, the staggering amounts of civilian deaths as a result of this war, and that's just an estimate. But you think like, okay, the First World War, there was massive death and destruction, but that was mainly military personnel. Those were combatants that were part of those figures. The technology had not advanced enough by that point. Obviously, you did not have the aircraft technology at the time. By the Second World War, you have fighters, you have B-52 bombers, you have this massive arsenal of military aircraft that can be deployed to target central urbanized centers. And so that's what happened in these firebombing raids. The Germans did this with Britain and in parts of France. Japan was doing this to places in Asia. But the Allies also reciprocated. The Allies targeted places throughout Berlin, bombing civilian locations, and same in Japan. And obviously, with the atomic bombs, those were civilians dying. Another sort of romanticized conception of the Second World War here in the United States was that as soon as the war started, men just like sprinted to their draft boards to be part of the war, when in reality there was a majority of the soldiers were drafted. So you can see just over 61%. And then I mentioned, there's segregation still going on, and the armed forces were still segregated during the Second World War. And thinking about, you have this governor in Georgia, Eugene Talmadge, who strictly enforced Jim Crow laws, even on military bases, wanting to keep white and black soldiers separated, making black soldiers sit at back of buses. So again, this idea of, you're asking someone to give their life possibly for their country and still treating them as a second class citizen. So those are the things I wanted to wrap up with the Second World War to kind of get us ready for the next lecture. And how I want to do the rapid writing responses now is, if you have a question about any of the lecture information material, please email me. I am happy to respond to your question, to your inquiry. If I see a large influx of rapid writing questions coming in, I am more than happy to put together like a rapid writing response video that you can kind of go through then and hear the questions, kind of like I do in class. Go through and provide some resolution and answers to some of those questions. So anyway, I'll see how the response is there. But basically trying to give some feeling of, a normal lecture and everything that we were doing. And I know rapid writings were a part of that. And I don't want to deny anybody an opportunity to ask a question, because that's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you continue to acquire the knowledge and information and skills that you sought out to receive in this course at the beginning of the semester. So please do not hesitate to send any questions, concerns you have. And I will be happy to continue on through with the remaining lectures that we have, and our next one will be the atomic age.